This panel is looking at value, vulnerability and risks, and building on the previous presentation, we're very fortunate to have three great, relevant but quite distinct perspectives on that. So very briefly introducing the panel, and please, I'm not going to read out introductions. I think there's nothing worse than that. Have a look in the book if you want to know the detail. On my right is Steve Williamson. Steve is the Director of Governance, Risk and Compliance for GlaxoSmithKline. Sitting next to him is Troels Erting. Troels is the Chief Information Security Officer for Barclays. And sitting at my extreme right is Professor Paul Cornish, Research Group Director, Defence Security and Infrastructure for the RAND Corporation. This session is 40 minutes. There will be roughly 10 minutes at the end where we will be inviting questions from the floor. So please think as we are going through this about your questions, and we'll pull people. There'll be some roving mics towards the end of the presentation. So, time being of the essence, I want to pose the first question. From my experience, and we do a lot of incident response in Microsoft where our customers have had compromises and problems. Very few organizations really seem to know what is happening on their infrastructure and networks. How, in your organizations, do you manage your high-value assets in a way that you can secure them, yet at the same time you don't paralyze the business? Yeah. Steve?
Yeah, great question. I think first of all to say, in a large organization, it's impossible to protect all assets at the same level. You just never do it. You just can't keep up with patching, with the monitoring. So what we do is, the approach is to identify the highest value assets and protect them against the most likely threats. And we start with the data. The data is most important. So we identify the most important data categories. That could be pre-patent intellectual property, consumer and patient data, highly sensitive commercial data. Then we look, where is this data stored? What applications are processing this data? And how is this data transmitted across the network and sometimes outside the organization? And that gives us a prioritization. So it filters out all the sort of low level, I wouldn't say not important, but less critical servers and components. And it gives us a top list of the most important assets. The most important assets will be those applications that are business critical, those that contain the most sensitive information, and the infrastructure assets that store credentials, our domain controllers, for example, which are compromised would paralyze the organization. So first of all, that's how we prioritize, and those assets get the most important treatment, the greatest defenses, the closest monitoring. It's not as simple as that, because we do have so much data generated from our threat defenses, our SIMs, for example, our data loss prevention, our vulnerability scans, produce mountains and mountains of data, and the clues to suspicious behavior are all there. We just got to filter through it, and it is quite a job. But by subdividing the assets, identifying the most important assets, and putting extra focus on those assets, extra monitoring, it helps us break down the problem and structure it in that way.
Okay, just a sort of secondary question before I go to Troels. So just listening to the number of systems and things that you defined as high value, sort of seemed like almost everything. How much?
No, not at all.
No?
Not at all. To give you a range, maybe off the top of my head, let me think. Of all the applications we've got and all the systems, there's probably 10% that very high value. I mean, it's degrees, and we have a risk framework, and we have impact factors in terms of what would really damage the company in terms of stakeholder confidence, financial impact, and essential operations. Yeah, maybe about 10% is really what we need to worry about. Okay. Not to say the rest is not important and wouldn't cause disruption, but in terms of what's going to hit global headlines, what's really going to impact the company severely.
Okay.
I'll say about 10%.
So, Charles, let me ask you the same question, and I'm going to ask you the same supplementary just so you know it's coming.
Okay.
So from the Barclays perspective, how do you manage your high value assets in a way that you can continue to run the business securely?
I think the way we address the problem is to, first of all, look at who is it that wants our assets. So who are the adversaries? Is it nation states? Is it organized crimes? Is it terrorists or whatever? When we have made an assessment of this, we look at what is the intent, because some of them want to steal our funds. Other ones, they just want to listen. Some might even just want to manipulate. Other ones, they want to erase. And when we have looked at that, we see, okay, what kind of tools will they use for that? Then I look at my own network and say, where are the vulnerabilities? Then the point, where's my crown jewels? And what kind of controls do we have? So I agree that we have huge data loads in Barclays. We have 50 million customers, 140,000 employees, and we have millions of folders of all kinds of information, and we have payment systems. So what we have done is that we have identified what is the most vulnerable assets for us, valuable, but that can also include HR files, for that matter, inboxes at a certain level. So it doesn't have to be money, it can be other things as well. Then we try to segregate these crown jewels and put in extra protection and a bit more monitoring on those. The rest we still have a perimeter for, but we try to have a extra strong protection on the crown jewels. But it's not enough to have a strong control on the crown jewels. We also need to monitor who have access to those crown jewels also from the inside. So in Barclays we have high valuable employees also that we monitor closely. So if we have 140,000 employees, we don't monitor all of them at the same level. A lady in a branch doesn't have access to some of the crown jewels, but there might be 4,000 or 5,000 with admin rights, privilege right, and we monitor those guys. Because first of all, we're afraid, like the previous speaker said, for insiders, either our own insiders or people who are blackmailed or whatever, but also because organized criminals will eventually, because they are moving up our value chain now, and we can see this in a number of attacks, they will try to take over the privileged access for somebody else and act like they were my employees. So that is also why we need to look into that. So it's about both identifying your most valuable assets, protect them extra, and then monitor those who have access to them, and then find the right balance so you still can run a business. And that's all about risk. And where is the red line for that risk assessment? So
let me ask you the secondary then. So roughly how much of your infrastructure or your systems would you define as high value assets that you would give that enhanced protection to?
I think it's difficult to assess it percentage wise, but I think what you will see is that we have payment platforms, SWIFT payment platforms, we have HR files, we have intellectual property, but we also have investment bank who are operating very much on the mail system with very sensitive information that you can be very rich if you have this information, or you can be very poor if you manipulate these information also. So I think it's a number of these that will be in center, and then there will be other ones that we still protect rather high because we are also heavily regulated, so we have a high bar, but then we just increase the bar a bit. Yeah. The problem is that the criminals are developing a penetration system that is very advanced now. We just saw that again with the attacks on the SWIFT payment system, which causes me gray hairs from time to time also, and see the development in how good they actually are and how much time and resources they have to prepare.
Okay. As an interesting aside, one of the things we've identified in terms of high value assets from our response work is people's Active Directory implementation. Yeah. We actually now classify that when we do an assessment as almost the first thing we look at, because if your Active Directory implementation is poor, then that probably makes a difference from a compromise that is contained to one that owns organizations. But I want to move on to Paul. Paul, my previous question to Stephen Trolls asked about value. Value is an interesting thing when you talk about cyber. You hear different statistics bandied around what's the value of cyber attacks against the UK infrastructure. Can we generalize about value? Is it context specific? What do you think?
Bob, thank you very much indeed. I should preface my remarks by saying that unlike Mike Lynch and unlike my three colleagues here, I don't have any useful practical experience at all to offer you, indeed anybody else in the room, non-operational. I am, if you like, the panel smart ass, so please take my regards in that tone. Can we generalise about value, vulnerability and risks? Well, I'd say that, and apologies for being sentientist to those of you who are not sentient, but I think that every sentient being is, of course, his or her own expert in risk management. And none of us need help at all, do we, to judge what is valuable to us and what's vulnerable and why and so on, and what we should do about it. We know how to do that. And similarly, every business and organisation here, I would imagine, knows how to run their own risk register. They are their own expert. We've heard already about high value, about red lines and so on. And I would assume that, that both Steve and Trolls know what they're talking about. It doesn't matter to me largely because I've actually stopped taking antibiotics and I bank with NatWest, so I'm fine if I'm wrong in that regard. But I'd say that this is not all about, it cannot be all about anarchy. We can't just leave it to ourselves. We can't just assume that our judgment is all that we need. We do need a common understanding of some sort. I think societies, for example, will always have crime. We know we'll always have crime. But if we want policing and if we want law, then clearly we have to have some understanding about which crimes matter most and what we should be doing about those crimes and so on. So a very simple analogy, forgive me for that. I'm very wary of standardization, I have to say, of trying to produce a common language for anything. Some decade ago, David being our super chairman, Bob being just our chairman, our super chairman and I were involved, I think it was about a decade ago, David, in producing a report at Chatham House in which we began by saying one of the things we're going to do is produce the glossary of terms. We're going to pin down everything, as Steve said, about cybersecurity, cyberspace. It'll be a 3-pager at the back of our report. Simple. And it lasted a month before we gave up. We just completely abandoned the idea. There was no chance we were going to produce anything that would be any use to anybody. Let's look at the agenda we've got here today, though. We've got hardware, process, data, and people, all of which, it seems to me, must be valuable, and they must be vulnerable. So how do you prioritize within those categories and across those categories? This is what interests me. I think we need to try to be more systematic and perhaps less impressionistic. I think we do need something like a common language to talk within sectors, across sectors, between private and public sectors, intergovernmentally, and you name it. And this isn't an advert, but I'm very closely involved with the Oxford Martin School in Oxford. And what we're doing there, with the sponsorship of the Foreign Office and with the help actually of lots of organisations represented here, one of our projects is to produce a model for harm. We're trying to be systematic, to produce a systematic modelling device, but what we're trying to say is instead of looking at attack and attackers, let's look at harm. Let's look at the damage that can be done within or from cyberspace. We think this is a different approach, and it gives us, we think, a more of a chance, more of a stab at being systematic. We're looking very briefly, sorry I'm banging on a bit, we're looking at the national level, at property and infrastructure levels, organisational level and individual level and so on. And within all that framework, we're saying there could be various types of harm that we need to think about and talk about. Physical, psychological, economic, reputational, political, and even cultural, the softest sort of harm you can imagine. And what we're trying to argue, and I'll finish on this point, is that if we can achieve, by virtue of some sort of a settled language, not a definitive glossary of terms, gave that up a decade ago, we're not going to reach that, but if we can get some sort of a settled language within, let's say, the insurance sector or the reinsurance sector, we all begin to know what we mean. I mean, I know that the banks talk to each other and they do use a common language about cyber risk and cyber threat and so on. We know that. I'm saying that we need more of that because then we can generate more confident decision making in the C-suite and we can actually, if you like, embark upon a rolling audit of where we are, what our values are, what our vulnerabilities are, and how we can learn how to close those. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Paul. My next question is to the panel is about appetite for risk. And I go around organisations and I talk to people, and one of my questions is, what's your organisation's appetite for risk? And I get all sorts of interesting answers. Now, I'm really interested, before I ask my panellists, just for a show of hands, to make sure that everyone is actually still conscious out in the audience. A show of hands, how many people in the audience work for an organisation where you can say, put your hand on your heart, that your organisation has a well-defined and articulated appetite for risk. So if you think your organisation has that defined appetite for risk, can you just raise your hand? Okay, so that's, I would say, probably about 5%.
Yeah.
About 5. Okay, that's interesting. So let me then ask our esteemed panellists, starting with Steve. So have you articulated the appetite for risk of Glaxo? How do you nuance that?
You probably won't see an explicit risk appetite statement. But if you read, say, the annual report where you get the principal risks, and if I look inside the company at our internal risk and compliance framework, the risk appetite is implied by our risk scoring matrix. So there are certain impact factors. Reputation is up there. In our industry, product quality, patient safety, legal and regulatory compliance. These are big liabilities for the company, so the appetite for risk is low there, and that's reflected in our framework. So although not explicitly articulated, it is quite well reflected in our controls framework and our policies and procedures over what we're allowed to do. So that's quite clear. But risk management is a balance between risk and reward. And let me expand this example. So in order to improve business processes, be more efficient, we have to adopt technologies. We're talking about mobile. So going forward, there's going to be more mobile, there's going to be more processing of data outside the company. This means more devices processing data, more people accessing our data, more stuff in the cloud. You put all the security you like in there, but what you're doing is you're expanding the attack surface. So you're giving threat actors more opportunities, more entry points into your data. And risk management is a balance. We have to allow the business to progress. We have to allow innovation, but do it safely. And there's two things here. One is getting the right combination of safeguards to make sure people can do it safely, but also knowing when to stop, knowing what is not safe to put out there. You know, maybe processing promotional material for retailers by their sales force. That's probably a risk we can tolerate, we can accept. But if we're handling regulatory significant patient data or so, then we'd probably hold back on that one.
Okay, so let me put you on the spot here.
Okay.
Because when they said be moderator, they said don't hold back on the panel. So do you see yourself as an enabler in the organisation or as a controller in the organisation?
Mostly an enabler. Enable the business to use new technologies to advance, but do so safely. That's what I see my role.
So Charles, let me ask you the same then. From your perspective, how do you articulate the appetite for risk within Barclays, and how do you communicate that?
I think for big financial institutions like Barclays, trust is in center now. So we have a contract with our customers that we can actually keep their information safe. It's their identity, their money, anything they do. We know lots of things about people's behavior, when they pay, how they pay. And I think that will be in the future a competitive, a differentiator trust. So to keep our data secure is in the center here. On the other side, we are still a bank that needs to create money. So we look at three things basically when we operate. That is privacy, security, and then convenience, because our customers, they want convenience. We can build in all kinds of security system that is very, very difficult to penetrate, but nobody wants to use them. So we have no customers, but we have safe information, right? So it needs to be in a balance here for us. In my strategy as a CISO, I have 4 legs. The first one is to protect the estate. The next one is to enable my business to get to the front line fast. The third one is to innovate, to stay safe. And the last one is to educate in order to also enhance the human firewall, which is probably the most weak of all the firewalls that we have. So when we look at risks, I look at what is group risk. What can Barclays not afford to lose? That could be all our credit card numbers. That could be huge loads of money. That could be HR files again. We're back to the crown jewels. There must be a red line under these things. We cannot go lower here. We need to actually protect them inside appetite. Then we go to the businesses and say we have roughly 4 businesses. But the most important is the private public banking, the investment banking, and our carding business, debit card and credit card. And let's take an example of risk in the credit card business. It is, of course, rather easy to skim a card. That's why we put in the EMV standard, so you have a chip. But you can still steal the information on your credit card, the number on front and the number on the back, and then you can go online and you can order whatever you want, and you will get these products paid by your card, but I will get it. This is called card not present. One could probably enhance the security here, but again, I think that we earn more than we lose. So it's about also finding a way in the balance here, so not make it too cumbersome, because you want something that is easy. That's why we moved for mobile payments, that we just swipe cards and other things, and it's small numbers. So it's very much about what is the group risk, what Barclays really not want to lose, and then again to the businesses, what do you think is inside your appetite, and then I adjust my security to be comparable with these standards. So here is the red line for the group, and then we might have a lower line for some of the individual businesses based on risk appetite.
Okay, so my supplementary, Charles, is in many of the organisations, particularly in the financial sector that we deal with, I often find that people in your position are caught in the middle, because people who want to develop new apps and new services for the bank want to drive them out really quickly, and they see the need for security audits as a hindrance on the way they do business. And when I talk to people at CEO level, they're really nervous about the security side. So you're the guy sitting in the middle of that. Yeah. How do you manage those conversations in a way to keep that balance and keep yourself at the right place in the organisation?
I think it's a very, very good question, because when I entered the bank 1.5 years ago, I think my organisation was known as the blockers, the naysayers, right? And because we are in a bank and because we are in a very competitive world, we need also to be facilitators in security. In the old days, we were always the last ones to entering the development process. So when you develop a new application, new platform, whatever, you're right, everybody wanted to be very sexy, and just 2 minutes before you want to launch it, we probably need to pen test it. We probably need to have a look at it. Is it safe enough? And then we put down the foot and said, no, you cannot launch it, and then we got all the fuss. So what we have done now is that we have actually changed that system. So now we inject security from the very beginning. So it's security by design. So my guys, engineers, architects, solution people, and pen testers will be in from the very beginning, knowing where the business wants to go. And instead of pen testing, in the end, it's already done. So that has changed a lot, because Barclays is almost a software company. I think we have 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 developers. So we produce all the time, and we need to do this just like Google and everybody else. So we have moved it forward in order to have speed and create the right security.
Okay. Paul, I'd like to stick on the same theme. From the work that you're doing, particularly perhaps on your maturity model, how do you help organisations start off? Because in most cases, if you don't understand your strategic approach to risk and then therefore what you need to do, it's very difficult to do anything else. So how do you see this from your research perspective?
Appetite for risk, it seems to me, it's not a law of nature. It's a judgment, it's a decision, and a particularly difficult one, it seems to me. I think we have lots of knowledge of risk in cyber, a vast amount of knowledge in this room, vast amount. But without wishing to repeat myself, I think I'm not too sure that we've got the commensurate level of understanding, and that's what really rattles me. And in that context, it seems to me natural to be risk averse. By natural, I mean rational, to be risk averse. This looks to me to be a little bit like uncharted waters, even though we know, we see lots of stuff going on in those waters. Sorry, I'm slaughtering this metaphor. I'll stop now. It must be difficult also. And at Oxford, we tried to model the very difficult challenge of modelling the cascading consequences of any event or attack, or whatever you want to call it. It's extremely difficult to do. And in those circumstances as well, it seems to me, if you don't know, and if indeed the attacker doesn't know what's going to happen as a result of this attack, then again, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be cautious, you're going to be risk averse. And if I just say very quickly, I do work, as Bob said, for RAND Europe, which is the RAND Corporation's smaller version of itself in Europe. Overall, it's a vast organisation. It's a massive think tank. I don't know, about 5,000 people or something. And it goes through the same sorts of processes to protect itself and its clients and so on that all of you do. Of course, we all do the same sorts of things. But I would say, a one-line judgment would be that it has a rather low appetite for risk, unless through trust measures and whatever else, and less and until proven otherwise. And it tries to achieve that without, of course, interfering in process. We're all doing the same sorts of things. What are we trying to do with the other part of our experiment at Oxford, which is this capacity maturity modelling exercise, is to try again with governments and increasingly with the private sector to say, you've got to sort of get a comprehensive understanding of where you are, government, what it is you're trying to do, and where all your different cyber-related activities are, what stage you are in each of these, and how you can improve your positioning and your competence, your capacity in each of these areas systematically. And I think we've done something like 43, 44 governments around the world so far, and we're indeed the UK too, and we're hoping to do more of those. And I think that's the main contribution, I'd guess, Bob. But the main response to your question is to say be systematic about where you are, and therefore where your vulnerabilities might be. And that, it seems to me, at least gives you the beginning of a basis for understanding how much risk you might be able to take in each sector and each subsector and so on and so forth.
Okay, so my turn to put you on the spot now. Paul, this is great. I want to do this more often. There are different approaches by governments to supporting and enabling cyber security across industry, both large, small and SME level. From your perspective of having looked across many of these and developing the maturity model, what do you think, which way should governments be going to support this type of activity? Because there's a real continuum to a very light touch regime to quite intensive and intrusive restrictive regimes that governments around the world are adopting in this space.
I'd be really, and I'm not sloughing off the question, but I'd really be interested to hear Steve and Troll's answer to that as well, and perhaps others in the audience. Having followed the UK government's approach reasonably closely for the last 10 years or so, and I'm not just saying this because of where we are, but I think it's got its finger on the pulse. I think it looks to me as if it's probably about right. It's a bit directive from the centre, but it's also quite participatory, and it's quite the talk of partnership and so on. And that seems to me to be about right. It's trying to provide information often on a very, very highly confidential basis. It's trying to facilitate and do all these good things. And my guess is that that's got to be the way things go. I mean, we've all heard of this, irritating formula that, in the critical national infrastructure, government owes 99% of the risk and 1% of the property, whatever, and flips over for the private sector. You all own the stuff, but none of the risk. And so there has to be partnership. It seems to me there's no other way around this. And I think UK government's probably got it about right, dare I say, possibly to house a protest. I'm sure there's lots of improvement that could be made. But on the face of it, from the outside, it looks about right.
Okay. I would actually like, so Trolls, do you have a view on the role of government in getting this right?
I think that I think you're right. I think in the UK they have a very, very good cooperation approach to how to solve the problem. I think, and also again when I came, I think in the private sector there was a bit of concern about sharing any information, right? So banks tend to not to share maybe they did, but a bit too late and a bit too thin, later information about an attack. And I simply think that is completely wrong. It is not a competitive differentiator to protect our network and to catch crooks. We should cooperate about that every day. With my colleague banks, I should. Because if I'm hacked on a Monday, HSBC will be on a Tuesday. If they know how I am hacked, he can prevent that by changing his procedures or his controls, hopefully. And I'm happy to help my colleague here because I hope that he will help me back. If we then could give the indicators from that attack to the national police so that they could, together with their colleagues, actually identify the critical and the criminal infrastructure and maybe the people behind, then again we have done a bit to minimize the risk. Because the risk in cybercrime is very, very low and the profit is very, very high because nobody travels and everybody can be a cyber criminals and they can steal our money on a distance, and they do it every day. And that's why I passionately think that we should work much, much closer together. So we have invested in a cyber defense alliance together with 3 other colleague banks and with the NCCU, which is NCA's cyber unit. So we have deployed 15 people together in the same room with access to all our information. And the first one that will be called if Barclays is DDoSed or have a bad fraud attack, my guys will call me. The next one they will call is the Cyber Defense Alliance, because this is how it should be. And I hope that this will grow, because we cannot just send fluffy, thin information over normal channels. This requires in-depth information from log files and whatever. And in order to do so, you need trust again. We cannot trust 100 banks, but we can maybe trust 10 or 15. So I think we have a good cooperation. It's not completely successful, but we are moving in the right direction. And everything about also the new cyber defense center that the government is setting up, I think it's brilliant. And I think that the UK should be driving that in Europe for the rest of Europe, and then other ones will learn. The Americans are very, very good in this. They have NCFTAs and whatever, they're very good in it.
Okay, so Paul, I know you want to come in, and I'm going to ask you to be brief because we're into the 10-minute window where I really ought to be starting to go out. So,
just a quick information point. About 8 or 9 years ago, David Livingston and I set up precisely this at Chatham House, a virtual task force. In fact, it was David's idea, but I took all the credit for it, so here's me coming clean now. But we did precisely this. We got the banks and the financial sector using the good offices of Chatham House, working with the police central e-crime unit, got them all together, offline, everything quiet, no records, and it worked brilliantly. I think it's still working.
Okay. Steve, do you have a perspective? As a global company?
Just one last comment. I totally agree with Trolls. I think to be good at security, you need to have very good threat intelligence. I think a cooperation between companies and governments is essential. Yes, I think we really need to build on that. And one last point, I think the government can play an important role in helping small and medium-sized enterprises. Some organisations have got the resource to do it all themselves. There's a Cyber Basics, Cyber Essentials they've done. I think a small, medium-sized enterprises do need that support.
I wholly agree. Just from the Microsoft perspective, we likewise do we have a cyber defense operations center. I have just a couple of interesting figures that you might find interesting about what we deal with in that center. We're now looking at 13 billion authentications on our network per day, 6 billion emails analyzed for malicious content per day, 2 billion web pages scanned per day, 600 million reputational lookups on web browsing and emails per day. The reason I say that is because I was at a conference yesterday where someone suggested that the answer to this was redesigning the internet in a way that would make it secure. So, on that note, what I'd like to do is perhaps if we could put the house lights up a little, please. So I'd like to take questions. I believe we have roving microphones, hopefully roving. So, hands up if you have a question, please. I have a very firm hand at the back. If you could please stand up and identify yourself and then give your question.
Good morning, my name's Mark Edwards from Whiteboard Strategies. Very interested in the point that was made earlier about high value information, and it could well be in an email exchange between high-level executives within an organization. It may be a bit sensitive here, but I'd be interested in what your thoughts are on the Hillary Clinton email issues in the US, and whether it's, in some respects, being very much downplayed. given what you said earlier?
Right. My suggested slightly amended question would be, how do you deal in organisations with people who go outside your organisational security framework, and how might you mitigate that? Trolls, you're nodding intensely, so I'll go to you
but
first.
that's because we have a system for it, a DLP system. So we have a software that detects all mail traffic. If anything is contained in that mail that is security or, that is confidential or secret, I think that we will let it slip through, but there will be a warning to me, and I will then initiate actually a case on that. And everybody knows that we need to be very cautious. I think that the next challenge in this area is how we can implement a similar system on our mobile platforms, which will also be actually where we will in the future work from. So I think we need that. When that is implemented, we will continue. Then you have a long distance problem is that if you allow people to work from home, do you then have really a good DLP system? If he has his business here and he has his private here, can he take a photo of this and send it? So there will be challenges in the future to do this in a meaningful way, but we need to fix it.
Okay. Steve, do you have anything to add?
A very similar system to what Troll said. Email is monitored, warning signs come up if it's suspected, confidential, suspicious. I think the challenge is, again, in the mobile world, we've got convergence between personal computing usage and business computing usage. People suddenly use their own personal email account to do business emails, for example. So a lot is happening outside our network. I think that is really getting buy-in from the staff. It goes beyond user awareness training. It's education. It's not trying to control users, it's trying to educate them, continuous point-in-time education, make them aware of the threats. Most people want to do the right thing for the company. Let's build on that and educate them.
Paul, do you have an option?
No, well, nothing to add except to say that for the sake of balance, someone's going to have to ask a question about Donald Trump now.
It would be wrong of me not to actually point out that there is a capability in Microsoft email to identify any work-related documents so that you can actually, by policy, stop people copying work documents onto their personal emails or into Dropbox, and it's a policy controllable way. But it is a bigger issue as bring your own device comes in. Okay, I'd like to look for another question, and I have a hand down in the front. Same deal, please. So if you could stand up, identify yourself and pose your question.
Hi, good morning. My name is Sanjeev from Just Retirement Partnership Group. The panel earlier discussed about working with government bodies, security forces, and with like-minded organizations in terms of sharing information and fighting the risk together as a joint front. Where do you see, given that quite a number of you have a number of end users that are outside of the company, so customers, where do you see your role in educating these customers from a CSR perspective, if you will, from a responsibility perspective, to ensure that you are empowering them and supporting yourselves to fight the risk at the same time? Thank you.
Steve, do you want to go first?
Okay, so you talk about people outside the company interacting with us. To me, there are two categories. There are companies we have contracts with, and they're relatively easy because we say, okay, these are our policies and procedures. Let's look at your policies and procedures, and we'll come to an agreement on what's acceptable use or not. The other one are, let me give you an example, social media. So consumers now, they interact with companies by posting reviews about their products on websites and social media sites. That obviously you can't have contracts with them, you can't control that. That is more of a challenge. We can put disclaimers and educational up, but now in the industry, somebody might go onto one of our product websites or a social media page and post details about the medical conditions and our products. And suddenly we've got a liability to hold this very sensitive information and manage it according to regulations. So if there's a contract with a company, relatively easy. If there's no contract, just general interaction, yeah, it's a challenge.
Charles?
It's a good question because the majority of the losses we have is not by hacking the bank, but by hacking the bank's customers, steal their money and we reimburse them. So for us, it's also a win-win situation to raise awareness and also the defense by our customers. So we have a number of programs based on size. So we have Falcon programs for our mid-size, and we have Condor programs for our bigger customers. And I do a lot of outreach, and we have now established what is called an outreach and awareness team who will actually try to deploy some of this knowledge. But with millions and millions of customers and new customers and people who leave, it's of course a very difficult task to be at the edge. And that's again why we have to probably identify where can we lose the most and focus a bit here, and where can we lose the least, and then hope that we can do something on awareness, which is on videos or whatever. But it's a very good question, and I think again this is something we need to do to raise cyber hygiene generally. And if we could change the whole approach, you know, if we look at the way we looked at drunk driving 30 years ago, it was probably accepted, right? Everybody did it. Now it's not the same. If we could have the same approach to cybersecurity, that it's not good style not to have antivirus, not to update, and not to do this, maybe we could actually change a bit of the whole approach towards security. And I think that is the future of it.
Okay, we are at the end of our time, so I'm afraid we can't take any more questions. I'm very conscious of David lurking over my left-hand shoulder in a very meaningful way. The panel will be available at the coffee break for signed photographs, autographs, honorary doctorates of Oxford. So please come and talk to us if there's anything that you would like us to have talked about but we haven't. And I would ask, please, can you please show your appreciation of the panel in the usual way? Thank you.